Miguel Iturrate back here on the Cage Rage podcast, and I'm joined by Devin Miller, and we are live on Facebook as well. We're going to try something new. We are on episode 77 of the Cage Rage podcast, and we're going to delve into MMA news. Too much to talk about to not do a whole full-length podcast. We got Conor popping up back on Twitter saying, see you in the octagon after a pretty heated exchange with Khabib's people. We've got a tie into that going down in New York with Paulie Malignaggi and Artem Lobov getting into a shoving match, and more nonsense on there. And I'm skeptical on how big the bare knuckle boxing thing could be. But Conor's been sticking his Twitter head in on all sides, and then from there are a million other different conversations we're going to have. Jeff, how you doing?
Man, I'm doing good, man, and I think we should start there with the Paulie thing, actually, and not even the Conor Khabib thing, because that's going to take us down a rabbit hole of talking about different cultures and all sorts of stuff. But when it comes to the Paulie Artem thing, I don't know. I'm guessing that you probably thought the same thing, because I'm not as well-schooled in boxing history, and I haven't been really around following boxing nearly as long as you have. And even the little bit of boxing I do follow, it's a very casual level, nothing like how I follow MMA. But to me, it was kind of sad to see Paulie Malignaggi that low now on the competitive level, that he's in a tussle with Artem Lobov, really a joke in the MMA scene, just to stay relevant at this point, because Paulie Malignaggi was a legit world champion in boxing. So that was kind of, I don't know how, I was actually kind of interested to see how you perceived that, because I thought it was kind of sad, to be honest.
Yeah, it's got a little bit of the, that freak show aspect to it already. The fact that, it's crossed over to bare knuckle, which, respecting what we're talking about here as martial artists, in terms of boxing, in terms of, your background in MMA. I mean, the bottom line is I consider it or maybe a derivative, but it's a different sport. So Paulie's going to be delving into a different sport. To me, it's a sport where I don't know. It kind of is important to have some power, and Paulie was never a huge power puncher. Sure, he'll be more damaging with his blows, with no boxing. Here's the thing, though. To me, Paulie's one of those guys that's in pretty good shape because he's no dummy, and he caught on as far as being a broadcaster, and he's excellent, right? So he's got his future lined up, and I think the whole, the whole sign him up, to fight Mayweather, and then and then the Conor thing and him kind of hanging around there and stuff. I think that's the true indication of where Paulie's coming from. I think Paulie would like to cash a big payday, and I don't think he's that ashamed of it that he won't try this way. I think whatever's going on with Artem Lobov is still, in some way, shape, or form, either going to get monetized in a way we're not going to believe, or it's in his head somehow leads to a Conor McGregor fight, which he will be able to monetize. Because I think that's what Paulie, in terms of reputation, he's done things for reputation. I mean, after he was done with the world championship level in boxing, and he was still fighting at a high level, but he's Italian, and, he wanted to be able to say, I won an Italian, welterweight championship. And he went and fought in Italy, went and fought in England for European titles and stuff, just to challenge himself and stay on top of things. So I think he worries about, legacy and things like that, but those weren't big payday things. So he did things for the ego and things, but I don't think bare knuckle really crosses over into that. I think the Italy thing was, part pride and things. This bare knuckle thing, and I don't mean it, in a bad way. Paulie does, if you can grab a $30 million payday, Papa, go for it. You know what I mean? And that's what he's trying to generate here. I don't think there's any shame there.
The thing is, he's not going to get that with Artem Lobov, though. And I think you're right. I think this is all about trying to sucker in a fight with Conor McGregor, and with all of Conor McGregor's up in the air antics and stuff going on. that's possible. I just don't think the UFC will let that happen at this point. And the bare knuckle thing, I mean, Artem Lobov, it's important to note, is fighting this weekend against another former UFC veteran, Jason Knight. They've both been cut over the past year. Now they're going to fight in bare knuckle, and I think we're going to see a lot more of that with this new bare knuckle FC. As a lot of these former MMA fighters are going to be making the transition over. We've already seen it with Phil Baroni and Chris Lieben, and so now we're going to see it with Artem and Jason Knight, and Paulie's making his way over there. And I think you mentioned before on the podcast, which I thought was interesting, that Conor McGregor and the Irish roots of bare knuckle fighting. That is an interesting story. But one thing that this led to was it got what Paulie did very good for the whole combat sport world is by doing this and having this altercation with Artem Lobov. Basically overnight, people forgot about the whole, Conor McGregor's retiring thing that happened last week, where he comes out and puts all that, because the next thing you know, like the next day, Conor just shares on Twitter like a wealth of Facebook pictures of that have now been released to the public of his sparring session with Paulie, and it's like 30 different photos of him just messing up Paulie. And if anybody hasn't seen them, I think that they should go look at those. And so that was the first thing he did, and it's kind of silenced Paulie up to this point. And then right after that, then all the stuff with Khabib started. And I think we can kind of go there now, kind of segue that, because the Paulie thing with Artem got Conor back in the public talking about fighting, and he clearly took a very big jab toward Paulie Malignaggi. And then the next thing you know, he's getting in this back and forth on Twitter with Khabib that has just reached a whole new level of personal. And now we've got a lot to talk about here. This is going to take up the majority of our time, because I think this is getting dangerous. I think this is getting dangerous when I listened to the early Cage Rage podcast you and Chad had leading up to the Khabib fight with Conor, and the ones you guys had right afterwards, where you guys were talking about how this situation got out of the UFC's hands. You had like an Irish mob and a Russian Chechnyan Muslim mob that these people don't play like we expect. They're not playing to entertainment rules. This is real life. And I think it's getting even deeper with Conor now insulting different cultures, and Khabib coming out and hitting him where it really hurts, calling him a rapist and stuff. What do you think, Miguel?
Yeah, I do think it's a situation, and we've described it before. The UFC, they really didn't have a handle around, what they were dealing with and the type of fire they were messing with. And when you let a guy like Conor, like I said, Conor's a guy who came out a few years back and he said, "I'm going to fight Mayweather." And he didn't stop saying it until it friggin' happened. People could say stuff all day and they can't make it happen with that. So once you've got an experience like that under your skin, so to speak, and it does lead to, I want to make $100 million, and then he did it, So now this has had an effect on this guy's ego. But at the end of the day, he's an Irish, kid, with, I don't know if he's got college background and stuff like that. Not that it matters all that much, but I don't know that he knows enough about Chechen and Chechen culture and what those people have been through the last, during Khabib's lifetime and stuff. It makes him very, very independent, very isolated, and very, very, like a modern culture with a warrior mentality. And Khabib now, even though in sport, has kind of become an iconic person over there, I following Khabib's tweets and stuff, he tweets in Russian extensively. And when you translate them and stuff, I mean, he went to a play performance in his home country, and the play was, I don't know if it was something that was LGBT or something like that, but Khabib, because of his religious stance, came strongly out against the play. He said, this is garbage kind of thing. And his voice is now powerful enough in that country that the producer of the play was on Twitter fast, apologizing and that sort of stuff. So yeah, you're talking about a guy who's got a voice and a guy who comes from a way people who've been at war, had their backs to the wall, and have a completely different mentality and a completely different value of life than Westerners do. And yeah, and to insult them, it's something I would never do. I would do not to build up a fight, not to do any of that stuff, not unless it was done, truly done in a work fashion where my manager called his manager and said, look, we're going to cross some lines. You go ahead and call me a rapist. I'm going to call you some type of religious freak, and we're going to cross the lines. But even in that type of circumstance, I think what you're getting at, and what we're going to talk a little bit about too, is even in that circumstance, the UFC had orchestrated it at that level. Now that you've invoked religion and stuff like that, you could have one of Khabib's 700,000 Twitter followers take it the wrong way, and he's not. They're not controlling all 700,000 Twitter followers. He can control his camp. So even then, I think now they've crossed some lines here. McGregor's always shown he would cross lines. Again, with Mayweather, I took everything with a grain of salt. But with Mayweather, the illiteracy stuff, he did go there.
But Mayweather will play ball. That's Mayweather's is a Western American who understands the business aspect, and he's motivated by the business aspect. That's his main motivation for everything he did, was making millions of dollars. It's why he'll stand just and make videos with him, probably with like $100 million necklace around his neck and just gold dripping from him. I mean, and he even labels himself as his nickname, Money Mayweather. That's not Khabib's motivation. Khabib, his whole mindset of where he comes from is he doesn't think the same as we do. That's what, leading all back to the whole, I did a CRP video on this about the Nevada State Athletic Commission coming out and wanting him to do this anti-bullying campaign thing for him to get a suspension reduced from 9 to 6 months after the whole brawl after the UFC fight back in October that he had with Conor. And he came out and he was just like, no, I'm not doing this. Vegas tolerates gambling and prostitution and drugs and all this. That's all over there, and alcohol. He looks at that as just like moral hypocrisy. He is motivated strictly for combat and insult, and that's something we've talked about before, like insulting a man's father over there. That means war. That means life or death. I mean, that's the biggest. That's such an insult to those people. And he's even went a step further and gotten even more intimate and close to that, because Conor not only insulted his father back then, he just made a tweet this week of Khabib at his wedding with his wife next to him, and she's arrayed in her wedding garb, and she has her face fully covered. He said, "Would you marry a towel?" And that received backlash. And then he comes out and says, "Oh, well, there's a goat underneath that towel." I mean, just really taking it there. And then Khabib comes out, and I'm going to read this tweet. He comes out and he says, "Rapist, comma, you are a rapist. You are a hypocrite who is not responsible for your actions. Justice will find you. We will see." And then Ali, I always forget his last name. Khabib's manager came out and he just said, Conor's screwed. Conor's screwed. And, basically implied we're going to find Conor. And then Conor's coming out talking about, another Dagestani, talking about the 205er. I forget his name. They just got suspended for life from the UFC for another USADA violation. He comes out and says, another Dagestani caught abusing steroids. That's 2 of 3 in this picture, busted for steroids. So he's really hammering that culture. And they don't think that that's funny. I really don't think so. I don't. Mayweather was probably looking at the, why are you carrying a book bag Floyd you can't even read as, oh, well, that's gold. That's gold. That's funny. That's gold. That's gonna generate even more attention. People are gonna be excited. People are gonna like that. And he's probably looking at Conor like, you have been everything that I've been wanting for years to have alongside me. And I don't see that with Khabib. I think Khabib's really going to take this seriously, and I'm afraid, like something you've talked about, I'm afraid of this getting out of control for the UFC. I'm afraid of. I mean, it isn't any secret that, and it's I don't really want to go there in this podcast, but I can send you some links. But when Conor was bringing up Ali being having some ties to some shady organizations in the Middle East, Khabib's manager, that's not a lie, and that's pretty well known. I mean, but whether calling him a terrorist might be extreme, but he does have some shady connections, and he's connected to some high places, and I do get a little bit worried about where this can go, especially when you've got Conor has shown that he'll attack a bus. I mean, this has been going on for a while now, and it feels like it's going to be, I mean, is this going to be the first example of Tupac getting shot outside the Strip of Vegas type of moment in professional combat sports in a while, where we could really have some kind of a crisis from all this? Because I don't feel like this is fake. I feel like this is getting a little bit out of hand, and these are two characters from two very different backgrounds than what Western Americans are used to. And it could spill over into something even more, more than what the average fan is expecting it to say the least.
I gotta admit that we are probably treading onto that level of territory, and Khabib continues to be somebody that I think the UFC is drastically misunderstanding from their Western way of looking at things. And they're realizing that they're not realizing rather that at some point, they needed to address this kid's differences. In terms of Dagestani and things like that. I mean, we live in the United States. I would have done whatever possible. I had at one point I had access to Russian fighters extensively, and we did an actual seminar with Fedor. Fedor did a seminar in New Jersey a long time ago for us. He actually did it for free, gave the money to the promoter to help out and to help promote the show and stuff. And but it was great to see the guy in Fedor there. But my promoter hired a fucking translator from the UN. This guy, this was a Russian English linguistic expert who would sit there, listen to what Fedor's saying, and translate it instantly. I mean, I speak English and Spanish very well. I can translate, go back and forth. But not like this guy. This guy was uncanny, his talent at language and stuff like that. But that was part of respecting that if you're going to go to a seminar with Fedor, having Fedor speak broken English and stuff like that, something's going to be lost. So if you don't have a translator who speaks Dagestani, you don't know what all your employees are doing on that week. You don't know, hey, here we are, we put these guys up, on the strip, and a lot of the fighters like to go out and have a good time, but all the talk around their coaches and stuff like that, they're not taking this real well. They should. I would think that that's important knowledge to know. I would think that it's important to know, because when you take people to Vegas, sure, 90% of the fighters probably want to go to a strip joint or go to a party or meet a girl, or what stays in Vegas doesn't leave Vegas, whatever. All of that is yeah, you use that, and then you've got that point of your customers, your employees there, who aren't into that, who are just not that type of person. And with him, you have that. So you've been bringing him to a place that you're used to using people to it. But you think McGregor bought the Las Vegas hook, line, and sinker? I think so. When he was sitting in a freaking suite in one of those big hotels, and they brought in guys with racks of suits to match his color of hair to the color of the orange in the suits and stuff, because that's the level of modeling and tailoring that went on with him when they started presenting him. $30,000 watches and stuff like that. He bought it hook, line, and sinker.
Yeah,
and if they try that with Khabib may enjoy it to a certain point, but when they tell him, oh yeah, but this comes with the next guy being able to tell your father to go fuck off, he would probably say, you know what, I don't need your suits. And you need to know that about your employees, I think.
Yeah,
You know?
and I like what you said about the UFC just totally misunderstanding Khabib, because here in America, when we think of like being conservative, we're thinking Ronald Reagan. That's not what, when we're talking about Dagestan and Chechnya and what's going on over there in the Caucasus and that part of Russia. When we talk about them being a conservative area of the world, we're talking a level of conservative that we don't see in Western politics by any means. I mean, they are that for. I mean, it's got to be like culture shock for Khabib to be transported to somewhere like Las Vegas that dubs itself, as you said, what stays in Vegas,
Yeah.
what's done in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's dubbed Sin City. I mean, it's the fight capital of the world. I mean, it's the gambling capital of the world.
They already look at Americans as decadent, and then you bring him to Las Vegas and show him all that, and the kid just goes, everything they've told me is freaking true.
Well, and then Miguel, you've got this brash Irishman that they've imported, who's making them a lot of money, who just a few months before their fight completely just barbarically attacked a bus, injured a few fighters, cost the show a few fights. He gets a slap on the wrist for it, gets the fight, and then they're wanting him to do an anti-bullying campaign because he jumped the cage and went after one of his cornermen who was taunting him after it. He looked at it like total, this is hypocrisy. Yeah. I'm not doing this. You're not gonna get me into this kind of situation. You guys are clearly favoring him and letting him get away with murder while you're trying to, you're trying to make me look like the bad guy in this situation. He's like, no, you insulted my father. You've went way too far. You kept me trapped on a bus while you're throwing dollies at it, and you've got your gang of goons surrounding it.
You cost me my main event.
Yeah,
you cost me a guy I know nothing about.
Exactly. Yeah, and
the transgressions from McGregor. Here's what, again, my problem during McGregor's rise. Everybody's watching the McGregor show, and okay, the McGregor show's the McGregor show, so everybody was turned on by him being brash. Telling me he's going to beat Dustin Poirier. I remember that fight. I remember thinking, he ain't going to beat Dustin Poirier. I got to the point where, because, with my background, I know Eddie Alvarez. I made 10 matches for the kid, and I love the kid, So I was hoping till the Eddie fight that, somebody was going to bust it up McGregor, but McGregor has answered a lot of the questions. But all the bells and whistles around the story, the whole thing, it's like, you have the movie, and then the sequel never does as good. And then by now, with McGregor stealing a guy's phone in Miami, and then maybe rape charges and all this stuff, it feels like Jason number 6. I've seen the movie already. He needs a new act, and he's still recycling the old act, and it gets more old and more tired. So what's going to happen is at some point, he's going to be looking around, and everybody sort of let him get away with stuff or whatever. He's going to find that he no longer is going to be able to get away with stuff. There's going to be at some point, he's walking around. He gets to his hotel suite. He's been making a lot of noise in Vegas or Ireland or wherever. He gets to his hotel suite with his key, and he's alone. And he looks up, and there's 3 bearded dudes. Where's the UFC help then? Where's lawyers, all that stuff? If he crossed the line, I'm not saying that's going to happen, but I do think that he's toying with needing a real lesson, and where it's going to come from. I think Khabib is ready to give it to him. The UFC has not shown him in any way, shape, or form that they want to teach him a lesson in any way. They've accepted absolutely everything he's done, down to the point where when he retires, and they're like, okay, bye-bye.
Well,
Dana ushers him away. All right, it's like, okay, everybody's like, oh, Dana didn't, yeah, but Dana endorsed his fucking whiskey. They don't want any brawls with him. They're doing absolutely nothing to, to curtail the guy's activities.
Yeah, and Conor's got some bigger issues also. I mean, there's been a lot of, he's having issues all over the place. I mean, there was that rumor and all those reports that were in mainstream press about him having some kind of issue with the Irish mob, but maybe 10 months ago. And so he's making enemies all over the place, and I don't exactly know what's going on with Conor. I think he's got, and then he's attacking random fans' phones, and he's just getting a lot of bad press. The one thing I will say is we've seen time and time again in showbiz and especially in sports, and Mike Tyson might be the best example, is that even bad press is really good press. And Conor McGregor is, even with all these horrible antics and it possibly being a powder keg that could blow up into something bigger than the UFC is even prepared to have on its hands, he might honestly end up walking into a rematch, a very undeserved rematch with Khabib. But at this point, that still is the biggest fight the UFC could put on. And with Conor McGregor keeping himself relevant through all these crazy antics, it could even be bigger than the first fight. So, that's going to be very big. But switching gears with you, Miguel, just because we've been on this topic for a while now, let's just move back to move forward to an early preview of UFC 236.
Well, hold on one second, because before we go there, I do want to dabble a little bit, because with all these things going on for Conor, he still had some time to retweet all the Paulie Malignaggi pictures and to send out all those details and kind of reignite that feud, kind of back his guy Artem Lobov up and stuff like that. But, what are the chances that we're going to see him in bare knuckle boxing? And then is his name such big enough that, can you make $1 million off a bare knuckle boxing fight?
I'm sure you could.
$1 million shouldn't be enough money to make Paulie degrade himself this way. I don't know, but Paulie's probably in the $7 to $10 million range as far as career earnings, right? Now, granted, obviously, you buy a house, you pay your trainers and stuff. So it's not like he's got the $10 million in the bank or whatever. But, once you've worked and gotten to a certain level, these Artem Lobov, how much could he be making to fight Jason Knight or whoever he's fighting this weekend? It can't be that much. It's going to be on pay-per-view. Do you know what pay-per-views like this, man? If they sell 30,000, 40,000 pay-per-views for a bare-knuckle event, now, granted, they've upped the profile of it, and especially with Paulie and these guys and stuff, they've upped the profile of it. But how high has it gotten? People are like, Melvin Guillard went to England and fought. I think, I don't know if Wes Sims fought or just accompanied guys, but there have been several guys. Was it Joe Stevenson, Joe Riggs? Some of those guys, from out West Coast. There are a couple other guys that are escaping. Oh, Chris Lieben. I think Chris Lieben's on the card this weekend. So they've gotten mid-range MMA names that are now left the sport and stuff, maybe still tough guys and stuff. Maybe guys, Lieben, was a tough guy reputation. Guillard is a slugger and stuff like that. So they Melvin Guillard probably got $5,000 for those fights. You know what I mean? That's what I'm hearing. If I'm wrong and he made 80,000, I'd love to hear that I'm wrong. But I think he was making about $5,000. So again, even if it were to jump and Artem Lobov and Paulie gets marketed for March, I don't see how they can. They're going to count on pay-per-view sales. I'm still not sure that Paulie's in there in a sure thing, and that surprises me a little bit. But Conor sunk his hooks into it today as well with all the media blitz, and now obviously his retirement is completely forgotten. But with all that stuff going on, he sinks his teeth back into it, and that's the only way this bare knuckle thing has a way of making everybody money is if McGregor somehow gets involved. And I know that you said the UFC won't let him do that and stuff like that, but if they did, I think Paulie's counting on that because the end game can't be a fight with Artem Lobov.
I agree, and the thing that confuses me the most is that Paulie shouldn't have to need this. Paulie, like you said, he's got to be worth in the millions right now. He's not a journeyman combat athlete like somebody like Artem Lobov. Artem Lobov, Jason Knight, Melvin Guillard, all they knew in their career was fighting, and they never really made it to the top at all. They were just journeymen in the UFC, and they are probably fighting for $10,000 to $30,000, and that's just how they make their livelihood. Somebody like Paulie's got to be worth over, like you said, in the $5 to $10 million range. And on top of that, he is a legit analyst for Showtime for boxing. I mean, he's a high. I mean, he's got other endeavors that he can sink his teeth into, and that he can do that he's very good at. I mean, other than guys like Max Kellerman and Jim Lampley, and some of these other guys that are really just professional pros that have been around for a long time. Paulie's been somebody that's been getting his feet in the door of being that next seasoned pro behind the broadcasting table. So he's got other endeavors to do, and this is just not making him look great, I don't think. And now he's having tussles with Artem Lobov in a promotion that's never really done anything. It's a big blow in my eyes from what he once was. And as you said, I mean the big path toward this even paying off would be a potential fight with Conor. And I think that's going to be very difficult to make happen for Paulie. And I don't see it happening.
Yep, I think it's too much. Now let's go ahead and do what we should have probably done in the first place. Let's get into UFC 236. We're obviously going to do some more detailed work on it next week. We're still about 10 days away from this fight, but it comes to us from down in Atlanta, Georgia. And I remember the old days of going to see the UFCs at the War Memorial in Augusta, Georgia and stuff. So it's nice to see him at a big arena, at the State Farm Arena there. Headliner, the interim fight between Dustin Poirier and Max Holloway. Second headliner, the interim title fight between Kelvin Gastelum and Israel Adesanya. So they're going together with twin title fights at the top of the card. And then obviously, a full night of fights, 11 other fights on the card. So let's start from the top. Where do you want to go with this one?
Well, this is the first time in quite a while that we've actually had a week off of the UFC schedule. I mean, it's so hard now these days to even follow all the UFC cards. We're getting them on a weekly basis. We're getting pretty high level fight nights every week. Definitely worth solid coverage week in and week out. This week we get a night off, and then we get to come back with a pretty good pay-per-view that's headlined by. This is the first pay-per-view in UFC history that's headlined with two interim title fights as the main and co-main, and you got the main event, a UFC lightweight interim title fight, which really this is very relevant considering that we were just talking about Khabib and Conor, because we got Khabib, the champion at lightweight, suspended, and Conor McGregor, the biggest star in the sport in that division, it's all up in the air. And then Tony Ferguson, who's been considered the number one contender, he's having some issues neurologically, and he's really up in the air of where he's going next. And now, so they're bringing up DustinPoirier, who's a top 5 contender, and the featherweight champion down to 145 pounds to fight for this interim belt. And this is actually a rematch. Max came in to the UFC around about 20 years old, about 7 years ago. Dustin Poirier was his very first fight inside the octagon, lost it, and now he's coming back later in his career, a seasoned champion. Done beat Jose Aldo, greatest featherweight champion in UFC history, and has become one of the top level guys in the sports. He's stepping up in weight class to fight Poirier, and it's a really good rematch. And I am not sleeping on Dustin Poirier in this fight. Dustin Poirier is very game, especially after what we just seen with Justin Gaethje over the weekend. People are really high on Justin Gaethje now, and people are forgetting that Justin Gaethje just not long ago got finished in the 4th round by Dustin Poirier, and which was a war. And so I think that we should keep in mind that Dustin Poirier is no slouch, and he finished Eddie Alvarez before that, and he's got wins over Max Holloway. So he's been in there with a lot of good guys. This is a solid competitor, but Max Holloway is becoming one of the biggest stars in the sport. So this is a very, very interesting fight and bound to be a really good, intense war, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think for Holloway, hopefully we see him move to 155. Hopefully he does well if he gets in the title picture right off the bat. so he can move on. I'd like to see him move on from 145. Maybe some of the questions around, the weight cutting and things like that will help alleviate him, and he'll be able to extend his career a little bit because there have been, he's pulled out of fights and there have been some medical issues around him and stuff. So hopefully we get a nice clean fight at 155 with no issues like that. With Max, hopefully performing at his optimal. I agree with him being the favorite coming into this fight because with Poirier, we've seen a couple of holes in his game. Again, with the Gaethje fight, as a gauge, just an incredible fight with both guys going at it, and that shows Poirier has some of that other essential stuff that you look for in a fighter. So I don't want to question him, but, he has gone out. He's been knocked out and that sort of stuff. And there are little chinks in the armor there. So I think the odds are okay. But I do think he's a live dog. And if Poirier catches the right wave and he feels like it's his time, going 0-1, moving up the weight class, Holloway can work his way back from that. So it definitely is an interesting fight, that I would label near pick'em.
Yeah, I would favor Holloway actually, but I think that Dustin's a live dog in this fight. I don't blame anybody for taking a risk and going with Poirier here because Poirier does seem like he's really found his groove as a competitor, and he's really taken a step in the right direction in his career, and he's really coming into his prime. Max, though, he's still so young, and yeah, there is a big elephant in the room. Though, there was a lot of concerns with him going into that Brian Ortega fight because he did have some neurological issues going into that. I mean, how Max Holloway was the one who was brought in to save the day when Tony Ferguson got injured with a week left to go. This was the fourth time that the UFC had Khabib and Tony scheduled, which still to this day, that's the fight everybody still wants to see. 4 times that fight's been scheduled, 4 times it's fallen out. This was the 4th time that it had fallen out. Tony tripped on a wire or something at a media day thing, was wearing sunglasses. He got a lot of credit for that. Got a lot of criticism for that, for wearing sunglasses inside, and later it comes out that he was wearing them inside it for medical reasons, that they were prescribed, which is interesting, but a totally different conversation. But when it comes to Max, he gets brought in on a week notice. He's going to save the day. He's going to step up. He's the 45 champion. He's going to go against the 55 champion, against Khabib. He was so big then. Now, keep in mind, he's the 145 champion. He gets called in on last minute to fight the 55 champion. He was so big then that he could not cut weight safely in time to make the weight, and actually was cutting weight so fast that he was doing an interview on Fox Sports with Michael Bisping and them, and he visibly looked like he had some kind of neurological issue going on. His eyes were, facing different directions and stuff, and he ended up having to pull out. They said it wasn't safe for him to cut that much weight, so he's a very big man. And then there was a lot of rumors that he has some form of CTE, and leading up into the Brian Ortega fight, that was a big topic, and people forget that because his performance was so great. Real quick, we're doing this live, so everything's coming in live streamed right now, but right here, I'm seeing breaking Conor McGregor backs down, promises octagon return, so we called that. But going forward, Max is a very big man. The neurological issues were definitely concerning. I think a lot of that had to do with his style, because he is a very get hit to counter. He takes a shot and he counters with 3 or 4. He's a volume striker that isn't afraid to get hit. So is Tony, and they're both having similar issues. But I also think a lot of it had to do with the weight cut, with him cutting so much weight, because he's a big man. He could be the first person, especially if they ever create a 65 division. He could definitely fight there probably, but he could end up. I mean, he's only 27 years old. He could definitely end up in his career at welterweight by the time it's done. He's tall. He's 6 foot. He's I think he's like 5'11", 6 foot. He's tall, he's thick, he's probably bigger in person than what we realize. That's a lot of weight to be cutting. So I think the move to 55 is good for him. I think he's actually going to be better. I think he's gonna be fresher in there. I think he's gonna have more power in his punches. So I think this is a good thing for Max Holloway going forward with his career, and I do favor him to beat Poirier. Although Poirier, I think, is a very live dog.
Yep, I agree with you, and I think some of the other things to look at here. You mentioned obviously Tony Ferguson on the shelf. He had some mental health issues of his own with his wife. Looking for help with him and stuff like that. And he's addressed it very publicly and very well. Where he said he went to a therapist and he's going through some help. But the UFC has very much kept him out of fights. He's on the shelf and does not have a fight program, whereas he was heavily into rumors before those types of problems popped up. So from there, the natural question comes up and here's the big question: so Conor comes back, say for July, or maybe at this point for September. Who does he fight? Because what's left at 155? Do they wait for him for November and stick him in against Khabib? That you mentioned might still be the biggest fight in there again, but that's become a dangerous thing. So it's interesting there. Anyway, let's go ahead and go over to the welterweight bout because I'm excited about Adesanya and Gastelum.
Yeah, it's a middleweight bout, but yeah, the middleweight the middleweight interim title on the line. Like I said, this is the first pay-per-view that's headlined with two interim title fights. Both the champion at lightweight and the champion at middleweight are on the shelf. You got obviously the lightweight champion. We've covered that tonight extensively with Khabib. He's suspended. He's vowing to return in November at Madison Square Garden. And so you got the interim fight with Poirier and Holloway coming up in 2 weeks. And Robert Whittaker, who was just scheduled back in February to fight Kelvin Gastelum to defend his belt in his home country in Australia, pulled out the day of the fight for emergency hernia surgery. And we all that was big news. And it came literally eight hours before people were buying the pay-per-view, planning to turn on the pay-per-view and watch it. And on that same night, Adesanya was scheduled to fight the legend Anderson Silva. So after the Gastelum-Whittaker middleweight title fight fell through, when Whittaker got injured, they bumped Adesanya up to fight Anderson Silva. And we, leading up to that, we were on here saying like that looks like it could be basically a mini four-man tournament at middleweight. You got the title fight obviously between Gastelum and Whittaker, the champion Whittaker, and then you got the legend and the new phenom in Adesanya versus Silva, and the winners would probably fight each other later on in the year. Well, with Whittaker getting injured, it kind of threw a wrench in all that. And Adesanya goes on to win a decision against Silva pretty handily. And now we're getting and Whittaker had surgery, so Whittaker's going to be out till around August, September time frame. Gastelum didn't have a fight. Now you got this big phenom with all this hype, Adesanya clamoring for a title fight. You got Gastelum, who had a title fight and got it taken from him, even though it wasn't intentional or nothing. And so they did the right thing, I think, and they went ahead and made this for April. But a great co-main, great interim title fight. The winner's going to fight Robert Whittaker. Adesanya versus Gastelum. I think this is the thing that's so great about this card with these two headlining fights is you've got four men that are either in their prime or coming into their prime. I would say four men that are in their prime that are going to get better. These aren't even going to be the best versions of these four men that we're going to see in coming years. I think there's a good possibility we see these men fight each other more than once. And they're all four very high level, good mixed martial artists, young, and I think it's a very they're very interesting matchups. I favor Max against Poirier. I favor Adesanya versus Gastelum because I'm still not 100% sold on Gastelum as a legit middleweight. I think he's a little small, and I think he's going to be a shorter man than Adesanya, and I think Adesanya is going to be forced to really open up a lot more against Gastelum's style. When Gastelum's got a very I'm going to get in range and I'm going to crack you with shots type of style, while Anderson has a very similar style to Adesanya, and they trained very similar ways and very similar techniques. And I think Adesanya knew that was going to be a chess match and that Anderson's going to know a lot of his tricks. When it comes to Gastelum, they're different style fighters, and I don't think that Gastelum's going to know the tricks that Anderson knows. to be so defensively sharp against a man like Israel Adesanya. And I think Adesanya's striking. If Gastelum's goal is to go in there and strike with Adesanya, I don't think, just with the pedigree and the background, that's going to be a smart strategy. So I'm going to favor Adesanya in this fight, but I think that this is a very good fight, and Gastelum, just like Poirier, is another very live dog.
I agree with a lot of what you said. The only issue I have with that is that I do think that in the old toolbox that Gastelum has a few paths, especially if he can get the fight to the ground in a favorable position and stuff. He has a few paths where he should be able to, be on top type of thing and dominate the fight. And, he's more well-rounded, I think, than Adesanya in the overall package, at least, on paper heading into the fight. So I think that's something to look at, because if he comes out and he's able to get an early takedown or two, that could take a lot of the steam out of what Adesanya is trying to do. But as I agree with you. I think it's an exciting fight. And I think the UFC is taking a little bit of a risk here with Adesanya, because at the end of the day, a lot of talk about these guys was that what the UFC ultimately wants is they want Adesanya to face Whitaker. And like you said, Gastelum is a live enough dog that you got to actually kind of consider that they're risking the fight they actually want, and they might wind up with Gastelum in there. And Gastelum, I think, would like to play spoiler, just to remind people too and stuff. Love or hate him, Gastelum's been through the UFC's chain, right? He won the UFC TV show, came up through the ranks. He's been back and forth with weight classes and things like that. So he's here because he's putting a lot of the work and stuff. But whether you like him or hate him, he's very well rounded. Very much a guy who this is his sport, and in this weight class, he may be a little bit undersized, but he has some very good wins at middleweight.
Yeah, he does, and he's got a very good left hand, and he's very good at getting in there and landing it. And he's actually a guy who he started his career in the Ultimate Fighter at the age of 20 and won it. And he beat Uriah Hall in the finale, and then went down to welterweight. He really struggled making weight down there, but I mean, he fought Woodley to a decision, and he's had some good fights. I mean, he knocked out Vitor Belfort, and that win was actually overturned for marijuana, if you can believe that, which is just, it's so ridiculous that that's still happening. But and he knocked out Michael Bisping, really sent him into retirement. And that was kind of Bisping just basically at that point in his career was just saying, I'm good. This new talent, is coming up. I had my run. I had my big money fight with St. Pierre. That was going to be my chance of having a win over GSP and Anderson. It failed, but I had a good run. He's in the Hall of Fame. He's got all these other endeavors. He got out of it. Facing somebody like Gastelum showed him this new level of talent that's coming in, and even he got out. So Gastelum's definitely a solid competitor, and he looked great against guys like Tim Kennedy. I thought he was looking really good against Chris Weidman until Weidman submitted him, but Weidman was the guy who, for me, just really showed that he's just a little too small for this division. And I know that was a different style. I mean, he was facing a really heavy top-level wrestler who is going to be able to take him down and control him in that aspect. And that's not what the type of fight Adesanya is going to bring to the table. But this is definitely a hype train type of fight. Adesanya is definitely who is being groomed as the new face of this division. I mean, Whitaker and Gastelum, they're definitely in their prime. You got you still got Yoel Romero floating around out there. But Adesanya is definitely the person that's definitely being groomed for this role as the next middleweight kingpin. And I saw that Anderson Silva fight as kind of a turning of the guard type of fight in that aspect.
Yeah, at middleweight, then you've got Whitaker there. So like everybody, we've got they're interim belts for a reason. So we've got the champions coming into the mix and stuff like that. Now we're coming up on an hour here on the CRP. You want go into some of the other fights on the main card, or you want to save that for a later date?
We can go into that on another day, but what I do want to touch here on while we're here is what we just saw over this past weekend with ONE Championship, because I thought that was pretty significant. They had a very good showing. I mean, that was a legit showing, and it couldn't have turned out any better for them. Not only do they I think what the best thing that could have happened for them happened with Mighty Mouse and Eddie Alvarez going over there, and what everything unfolding the way it unfolded, because and I'll explain why, because I think they still arguably have right now they arguably have the best fighter in MMA still. And even with that decision loss to Henry Cejudo, Mighty Mouse Johnson, I mean, if you look at the body of work over the past 8 or 9 years, other than John Jones, Daniel Cormier, other than those two, really, I mean, there's really no argument. It's Mighty Mouse. I mean, those are the three that are up there in that top three. Jose Aldo maybe, but Max Holloway's kind of there. Conor McGregor's kind of there. Khabib's kind of there. But those three really stand out. And Mighty Mouse was such a great champion, and he goes over there, looks very impressive. And what you couldn't have had for ONE to look really good is have both these UFC veterans, former champions, go over there and just dominate. And you didn't get that. You got Eddie Alvarez just got completely ran over. So that not only does it give them some form of legitimacy with the fact that they might have the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world over there with Mighty Mouse Johnson, and he continued to reinforce that truth. But they also showed that, you know, we're legit. We've got competitors that can beat former UFC champions. Don't sleep on us and think that they're going over here and they're gonna have a cakewalk. No, they've got good competitors over there. And you know, Shinya Aoki, you know, won their main event, and you know, it's easy to sleep on somebody like Shinya Aoki, who's been around for a long time and never fought in the UFC. And it seems like his best days were behind him years ago. But when you look at his record, I mean, he's been at the top of the level for a long time. He had 2 losses, one to Edward Foliang back in November of 2016, and then in November of 2017 he got finished by Ben Askren in one. But that's Ben Askren. But dating back to 2012, he's only had 2 losses, and then he lost Eddie Alvarez back in April of 2012. And before that, so dating back to July of 2010, he's had 3 losses. 3 losses in 10 years. So Shinya Aoki's a legit competitor, man. And he just avenged one of his losses against Edward Foliang, who he just beat over the weekend. I thought that was a great showing for ONE. We've talked on here about Bellator's welterweight Grand Prix, and you know they're doing better than what they were. They're grooming some new talent. They're going back to the Pride FC days with you know, the Grand Prix, and now you got ONE really showing out, and you got high level fighters and all. You got a former champion in Roy McDonald over there in Bellator. You got Gegard Mousasi, who easily could compete with Kelvin Gastelum, Israel Adesanya, Robert Whittaker, any of those guys. Top level middleweight over in Bellator. Ryan Bader's doing big things, and now you got ONE really putting a really standout performance on. They're on TNT now. They've got guys like Shinya Aoki and obviously Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson and Eddie Alvarez, a former top 5 lightweight in the hottest division in the UFC, just went over there and got crushed. So you know, we've really got 3. The UFC's still miles ahead of these other promotions, but this has been a good year so far, I think, for Bellator and a great showing for ONE over the weekend.
I agree with you, and I think you're right. I think you know, as far as ONE and you know the overall business chops and things are concerned, that Nasution's win over Alvarez does sort of you know have some coattails there for the promotion in terms of respect and stuff. It was an unexpected situation there, and it's interesting because there are a couple of differences in the rules with ONE that I'll take a minute to point out here before the end of the podcast here. But in ONE, Alvarez fought as a welterweight, And that's because what they do is you're declared your fight in the weight class that you walk around in. So Alvarez normally cuts to 155. It's not a huge cut for him, so he may walk into his fight at 158, 159. But walking in at 159 means you are a welterweight. And Nastyukhin looked a lot bigger and was probably nearer to the 170 top rank. They don't cut weight, so they never had to make the 155 or anything like that. They just fought it straight and had to be under 170 on the day of the fight. So Alvarez, being a small lightweight the whole time, was going to be at a disadvantage over there, and I still think he'd be a credible threat to anybody that they have over at 155. But that is something to take into account. They had a fight or die because of weight cutting, touching on this subject throughout the podcast. And that's why they do their weight cut management that way. I don't know if it's a great system or not, but there are people who are signing up for it. And I consider Matt Hume, one of the premier thinkers of MMA, and he's over there and he endorses the system. So, it cost Eddie a fight this weekend. In the long run, it may be a good system, but that's one of the things that you want to keep an eye on here. The other thing that makes one exciting is that you're allowed to kick down the opponents. And, that's something that, when you're in tune to a fight and you're watching a fight, a person, to me, it's frustrating in the UFC when a guy, might have a guy behind him or might have a guy tying him up and they're in real close and he's, on 2 feet. And just so he doesn't have to take elbows or knee strikes, he'll just put his hand on the floor. And that would not qualify him to be he's still coherent and actually taking steps, defending himself, but just touching the floor is not a defense in one. You got to be more on top of it. You got to be protecting your head and things like that. And that goes back to the old days in Japan with Pride and the Japan Valley Tudos and things like that before that. So, to me, it makes for a more exciting brand of fighting. Like I said, it calls upon, martial skill to get out of a position that in the UFC, you just have to touch the floor. It's kind of like a rope escape. It's kind of lame. So one does come with a couple of bells and whistles, and I think one in the United States may not catch on because the UFC is such a monster, and they do have those essential rules and stuff. But I think if you sat them down and had Matt Hume and Dana White in a panel discussion on ESPN over the rules, I'm pretty sure that Matt would be the more convincing of the two. Dana would probably be blustering, but Matt's going to back up, with real talk from the MMA world. Not that Dana's not real talk, but the rules are different in one because these guys know how to present them, and they, and what does that lead to? It leads to an exciting night of fights, like you pointed out. The fighters were comfortable, everybody was happy, and that's a cool thing. So I hope one becomes a player, but I'm not sure that they're still not up against a brick wall, maybe for the next decade.
Yeah, I agree with that, and they're going to definitely have to get a more wide-ranging marketing strategy in the States if they want to be a big promotion in the States. But it is important to know that they are the biggest promotion in Japan. I mean, you go over there, they're bigger than the UFC at this point. But globally, the UFC is still dwarfing them. They still have the top level talent, and the one's definitely. I think they're doing better at marketing themselves in the States. But also, I think the big thing that's just separating the UFC from Bellator and ONE right now, and I've said it again, I'll say it before, is just the depth of talent that they have at their disposal right now. And the UFC is able to put on card after card after card after card that would be top level fights in these promotions, and they've got it's so hard. Today you've got guys in the UFC who are on 7-fight win streaks, guys like Santiago Ponzinibbio and Leon Edwards, who are barely cracking the top 10 at welterweight, and that's nothing like it used to be in the UFC. I mean, you've got to really fight your way up those ranks to get to the top, and they're grooming in-house talent so well. I mean, they've got so many young talent that's going to be developing into future contenders and future stars in the future that are being developed under their umbrella. And now the UFC is being smart because they're building these performance centers all over the world on these different continents. Chad believes they're setting up a continental UFC where they're going to have literally individual UFCs from the continent to continent. I think they're just taking over, and I think this is just globalism, and they're just marketing everything. globally at this point, and it's just the ESPN is going to be a global brand that knows no nationality. The UFC is going to be a global brand that knows no nationality, and they're just getting used to just gobbling up all the talent so that they don't have One and Pride and all these different organizations from these different continents that are the big mainstream promotions in that region. I think the UFC wants to get in there and snuff these people out of the market. I think they're going to have a hard time doing that in big developing markets, particularly in Asia. But that's where the UFC is just so far in advance right now, and they're doing a great job at keeping a strong lock on the developing talent, I believe. And when you look at Fight Pass, they're starting all these minor league organizations that are coming up, and that's you got all these different promotions that are getting brought in on Fight Pass that are definitely going to be what a lot of UFC scouts are going to be looking at, and they're going to be looking at trying to buy up developing talent on the smaller circuits. I'm not sure that that Bellator and One have that kind of infrastructure in place right now that's anywhere near that level to compete with the UFC. So the UFC definitely is miles ahead. All I'm saying is this was a very good showing for One over there. And since you brought up Pride, and you brought it up in the subject of face stomps, as we wrap this live stream up, and I think this has turned out to be really good. I really like this format. I've enjoyed this conversation. We haven't set a time limit. We haven't said anything like that, but here in the future, we are going to have kind of a scripted thing, because I wanted to talk to you just briefly, not to go into details, but just to kind of, anybody who does catch this, does check this out, we are in the process of getting our notebooks together, because we're going to start a little mini series on the CRP between me and Miguel on a history podcast covering the rise and fall of Pride FC, because I think that was one of the most significant chapters in the young history of mixed martial arts. And I think that we're seeing a lot of what people learned from that coming back in Bellator and in ONEFC in different ways. As you mentioned, the different types of marketing strategy and the way that they market in One over in Japan, that Asian ethic of honor, and it's a different style of production. I heard the president on Ariel Helwani saying we wouldn't even want Conor McGregor. That's not the style of fighter, the style of athlete, the style of promotion that we want in our business. So they're taking that from Pride, even though Pride had the Rampage Jacksons and all that. It's notorious for the audience being silent during the fights and all this kind of stuff. And then we see with Bellator, they're bringing back the Grand Prix, which was one of my favorite elements of Pride, and they brought that back at heavyweight, and now they brought it back at welterweight. So I think that's really interesting that you're seeing that from these promotions. But we're gonna do a mini series. We're gonna do several episodes on the rise and fall of Pride. We're gonna start with the rise of Pride, how it came to be. We're gonna talk about some of the big fights. We might even do individual podcasts on certain fighters. We're gonna cover Rickson Gracie. We're gonna cover Vanderlei Silva. We're gonna cover Antonio Rogerio Nogueira. We're going to Rodrigo Nogueira. We're going to cover Crow Cop. We're going to cover Fedor. We're going to cover all of them. We're going to cover great fights of Pride, the difference in the rule structure. We're going to cover Chuck Liddell coming over and when the UFC tried to go head to head with Pride, and it really came back to bite them. And I know that you were around through a lot of this, and I'm very excited for that. So I'm just kind of plugging for this in the future, because I think we're going to have a lot of fun digging into the history of Pride and the controversial and corrupt nature in which it came crumbling down. That was interesting. But I just wanted to know if you have anything to say about that before we sign off, about previewing just what we're going to talk about when it comes to Pride. And if you see kind of a Pride kind of surging over into these promotions that are trying to compete with the UFC right now, kind of like I do.
Wow, yeah. It just it'll be a nice walk down memory lane. The thing about Pride was, Pride was the big show there, and I could tell stories from the beginning. Before this is pre-Zuffa, but pre-Zuffa, if a fighter had an offer from Pride or from the UFC, they'd be going to Pride, and that started from the very beginning, and you could see that. The very first Pride had John Dixon in it. John Dixon, UFC veteran and stuff. They were reaching. They didn't have a roster or anything like that. What really made Pride at the end of the day to me was the rise of Sakuraba, because that gave them a real legit superstar that was homegrown, and that's what they haven't had since. They burnt out Sakuraba and let him fight into his 40s and stuff. And at the end of the day, Sakuraba was an animal. He smoked and drank and stuff like that as well. So you don't age well in your 40s, and the end of his career was, but nothing. The magic of the early part of his career was just frightening. Sakuraba was all that, and then Rickson Gracie. It's funny because even now, you think back and stuff like that, and I've known, the highest level jiu-jitsu guys competing over, world champion after world champion in different weight classes. I've, you know, the famous Hoyler Gracie Eddie Bravo Abu Dhabi match. I judged that fight, so I've been around the highest level grapplers in the world, and what impresses me the most about Rickson Gracie is how in the jiu-jitsu world his reputation is really ironclad. You can rarely find somebody. The only time I've ever had somebody say this guy is on the level of Rickson, because everybody else that you talk about, and these are already starting to be people that are from a different culture, but there are people who regarded Laborio from American Top Team on the level of Rickson. In the later years, I heard, oh, he's better or he's there and stuff like that. But Rickson was the man with the unassailable reputation. And that's, at the end of the day, did he back it up? Did he show it? Here in Pride, he came out and fought a guy who they gave him millions of dollars to fight. And nobody was making $1 million in the UFC or anything like that. How can you say no? So yeah, Rickson's an interesting character. A lot of protection there. We never really saw it, and to test it to the level of Hoist, you know what I mean? But at the end of the day, but Hicks's reputation is so far beyond that of Hoist's that it's really a remarkable thing that they kept. And Rickson was always, a character that kept quiet and stuff like that. I met him because he came to the Abu Dhabis in San Diego, where he was working Ronnie Yaira's corner. And Ronnie Yaira, now a UFC veteran and stuff like that. But Ronnie, when he left Brazil and started to compete at the world level, was with Rickson for a little while. And then that was one of the things I remember. So Pride 1 was like Rickson's fighting. We're going to get to see him, and then that was in and of itself a miracle. Before that, it was just the Japan Valley Tudo stuff. And those were real raw shows with real raw rules. You saw people get knocked out with head kicks and things like that. So, yeah, I'll be glad to have that discussion. Very fun stuff.
Yeah, I actually was listening to Joe Rogan talking to this comedian guy talking about how Rickson wasn't the one that got brought in to the UFC one, and it turned out to be Hoist. And there's this theory that was the reason behind that was because Rickson was such a freak, chiseled out of stone looking guy, and Hoist was a little bit more unassuming, and they thought it would look bad and that it would actually prove more of a point for Hoist, who was a little bit less of a dominant athlete, to go in there and be submitting these guys compared to Rickson and that. But that Rickson was by far the staple of the Gracie family. That that undoubtedly he was the top Gracie, hands down. And you see him come out and that's something I'm looking forward to doing, is actually going back and reliving some of the early. That's why I want to take it very slow as we go through Pride, because it's going to be fun for me to go back and look at Pride 1 and look at some of these highlights of the early Pride days and look at that and do some study into it, because I remember watching the first Pride when I first became a UFC fan, and I'm doing everything I can to get my hands on early UFCs. And I remember they would sell them at they would rent them at Family Video and stuff. And it was a lot harder then. We didn't have UFC Fight Pass. It was really hard to try to get a hold of early Pride. We had to just catch them when we could. But I remember they showed some of those reruns of the Best of Pride Fighting Championships, and it came down to they got to one where it was Pride 1 with Rickson Gracie walking out, and he just looked like, I mean, you could tell, even though mixed martial arts was a sport that was an infant still. It hadn't even been really around for 10 years maybe. I mean, dating back to the pancration days. I mean, that was about right before UFC 1 and stuff. I mean, it was still very new, but he walked out like royalty. I mean, he was so well respected. It was like a god or something that was walking down to the ring to fight. I mean, he was such a big deal in a culture that wasn't even his. He was in Japan, and he's a Brazilian, and he was just so respected among those throwing the event and even the fans over there in Japan. So he was a worldwide household name, and he was the Gracies. And that's going to be really fun to dig into Rickson Gracie. And what I fear is that with a lot of these newer fans, that the real pioneer age, that from people that have became a fan since the UFC's really blown up in the States from about 2009 on, and really gotten big under the Conor McGregor era, is they're going to look at pioneers of the sport as people like Tito Ortiz and Randy Couture and Chuck Liddell, which they are to an extent, but it makes me worried that people like Rickson are going to be forgotten and not valued enough if the story is not told. That's why I think people that like yourself that were there, and people who are a little bit maybe unhealthy obsessed with the sport like I am, and have been for so many years, are there to tell the story on these figures. And I've always appreciated that you've done that since we've been doing the CRP with boxing. And I think we've got to get a head start on that in the with MMA. And I think there's no better place to really start than looking at the Pride years, because there's so much there to talk about. And I think it's going to take us a good 10, 12 episodes to really adequately cover it.
Yep, no, and I agree. Just to gloss it over, and to me, the Royce and the Rickson decision, it comes down to something very simple here. The Gracies understood they had something. They felt they had a magic something. They felt that worldwide martial arts had not caught up, and that they'd be ahead of the game. And they came out looking to take over the world. Royce went to the United States because at the time the United States was the second market. The UFC was going to be a $50,000 prize money, and Rickson got more than that to participate in the Vale Tudo Japans and stuff. And the bottom line is Rickson was further along on the pecking order and the more respected of the fighters, so he was always going to go where he was going to get more respect. They always handled him that way, and then at the end of the day, money counted. It made Rickson have to avoid the fire that Royce actually fought. Although the Vale Tudo Japans from '94 were very, very raw shows that, also, bear a little bit of a historic, looking back, the fight with Yuki Nakai and Rickson, with Nakai blind, to me, Yuki Nakai is a hero, is a guy that, should be considered. I mean, Rickson won that tournament. Sure, he fought 3 Japanese fighters, and he was superior, and he got through it. What Nakai went through in that tournament, having his eye almost removed by Gerard Gordeau and moving on and stuff, and you have to understand there within the politics of what Japan was, is Nakai was there as a Shudo fighter, and Shudo was a small organization that knew fighting, and that's what they were. They were hardcore fighting guys, not marketed, not anything like that, but they bought true, not pro wrestling oriented, not fake fight, not some of the fights are fake and stuff like that, like rings and pancrase. Shudo had that reputation, and Nakai's fight with Rickson is a historic one. Like I said, Nakai went into that fight blind because he beat Craig Pittman, who at the end of the day was also a pro wrestler. So it's the kind of stuff in Japan. But he fought Gerard Gordeau in the first round and almost lost an eye. And, Gordeau's a dirty fighter, and he always was. But that's something that, that's the early, rough days of MMA stuff. That's the fire that Rickson fought. But because it happened in Japan, that means going into Pride 1, he was already the icon that had beaten 3 Japanese fighters in Vale Tudo, Japan, and then repeat. I think he cleaned house twice on 3-man. He did. Royce won 3 UFCs. Rickson won 2 Vale Tudo, Japan. So he was doing the similar type of growth and fighting tournaments. That's what their bread and butter was.
Yeah, and man, there's gonna be so much to cover, man, and it's gonna be a fun thing to talk about. And
okay. Yeah, let's line it up. Let's go ahead and wrap up here. We got CRP 77. We're talking about Conor, and we're talking about the lightweight division. We're talking about all kinds of crazy stuff on the bare knuckle side with Paulie Malignaggi and Artem Lobov. We also covered the main events of UFC 236, and we did a little preview on what's going to be a future subject here for us, and that's the rise and fall of Pride, Japan's organization. And just to cover Pride 1, the card with Rickson Gracie against Takada, Takada being a pro wrestler from Japan who was a major draw at the time. I believe either he would later heel hook Mark Coleman in what is believed to be a fake fight for one of his only legitimate wins there, or if he hadn't done it before, he went into the Coleman loss needing a win because he'd lost to Rickson, and maybe Coleman did lie down for him. At that point, they also had Kimo and Dan Severn, UFC veterans, Koji Kitao, who was a sumo wrestler, Renzo Gracie on the card. He had a draw with Akira Shoji, Oleg Taktarov and Gary Goodridge, and John Dixon, like I said, fighting Kazunari Murakami. Murakami, kind of well known for he lost, I believe, to Maurice Smith in the early Extreme Challenge fights, and but he had a big unexpected knockout over Bart Vale, who at one point had a daunting reputation. So yeah, I'm glad to talk about all this. This is the stuff I remember it, kind of like yesterday.
Yeah, you probably remember a lot better than I do. I'm gonna have to be refreshed. That's why we did the UFC 60 history show, because that was the first live pay-per-view I ever watched live. So, I mean, I was getting into MMA in 2006. I wasn't, in 1996 when Pride 1, I think it was either 96 or 97 when Pride 1 hit, it was just a totally different era. I mean, that was going in to when the UFC was going through its dark ages, where it wasn't even, when John McCain was out trying to get it banned and getting laws passed federally to get it completely eradicated, calling it human cockfighting and everything. And, over there in Japan, it was this gigantic spectacle that was rivaling what we see with like the Super Bowl in America. And I guarantee that before the internet, a lot of people didn't even know it in the States, that the UFC was really that big. I mean, that MMA was that big across the pond over in Asia. I was just going to say that it's very interesting that Pride is that big.
Yeah, they were that big that long ago and stuff, and then the whole fall of it. And I do think you're going to have to. At that point, when we get into business talk and stuff like that, the true hero of Pride is Sakuraba. And with the fall of Sakuraba and the less attention there, they lost out. And what they really lack right now is that crossover star from Japan, somebody that is their homegrown star that they can rally around. So right now, MMA is not there. But here's interesting stuff. Right now, I guess the biggest company out of Japan would be Rizin, and Rizin's head of operations is Saki Gabara, who's the same guy who's in charge of Pride. So with that, let's go ahead and end the podcast. And I'm Miguel Iturrate for the CRP. He was Devin Miller. And this is CRP 77 MMA News. And we'll be back with a Pride retrospect look later this week.